Hello, and welcome to CyberBible 2.0, the online study of the Gospel according to Luke, sponsored by Union United Methodist Church of Quincy, Illinois. I'm Bob Morwell, the pastor. We take up with chapter 4, just after Jesus has completed his time of fasting and temptation in the wilderness and has moved to Galilee to begin his ministry. Galilee is in the northernmost part of modern-day Israel. In the time of Jesus, it was ruled by Herod Antipas, who was the son of the infamous Herod the Great. Of course, both Herods were actually puppets of their Roman overlords, who held the real power in the entire Mediterranean region. While many people tend to assume that Galilee is a barren, desert-like region, it's actually quite green and lush, and was so in Jesus' time. It's also distinguished by the so-called Sea of Galilee, which is actually a large lake, which is essentially a very wide spot in the Jordan River. Galilee is quite hilly. Nazareth, which is located almost in the center of the region, is a little bitty hillbilly town of about 500 in Jesus' time. It barely merited a spot on the map and was considered totally unremarkable. Folks living in the Quincy area could think of a town about the size of Ursa. About 6 miles away, there was a major town called Tipori, or Sepphoris. In 4 BC, around the time Jesus was born, it was the site of a failed anti-Roman uprising. The inhabitants were either massacred by the Romans or sold into slavery. The wrecked city was turned over to Roman collaborators who built it into a city which cooperated with the Herods. It's likely that during this rebuilding, the young Jesus and Joseph found work in the city as carpenters and stonemasons. Despite the defeat at Sepphoris, the anti-Roman insurgency continued to be very active in Galilee. It was a hotbed of revolutionary activity. These rebels were known as zealots, and they engaged in guerrilla war and acts of terrorism and assassination against Roman forces and their collaborators. They had some particularly bloody confrontations with the Romans in that area, leading to some pretty horrendous massacres in which they were always the losers. Nazareth was smack dab in the middle of this region, marked by revolutionary violence and the occasional massacre. The revolts inevitably ended in slaughter and further repression, culminating in 70 AD in the destruction of Jerusalem and the mass suicide of the last zealots and their families at Masada near the Dead Sea, and the slaughter of 9,000 others at a place called Gamla near the Sea of Galilee. Jesus clearly saw the cycle of violence as a literal dead end. One of the mysteries of Jesus' ministry is his return to Galilee and why he moved to Capernaum, a small fishing village on the shore of the Sea of Galilee several miles from Nazareth. It's never explained why he made this his base of operations. The village was as small and unremarkable as the one he left. When Luke picks up after Jesus returned to Galilee from the wilderness of Judea, he says that he traveled to various towns in the region, preaching and apparently becoming something of a celebrity. It's not clear if he first goes to Capernaum at this time, or if he'd been living there even before he went to be baptized. Eventually, he makes his way back to his hometown. He joins the people in worship at their little synagogue, where he's invited to preach. He chooses to expound on a passage from the book of Isaiah, chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The passage was originally a statement by the prophet that God had chosen him to bring a message of good news to the Jewish people who had been in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. Jesus then declares that this passage has been fulfilled. He seemed to be declaring that God had anointed him as a prophet in the same way that Isaiah had been 5 centuries earlier. That was big talk for a small-town boy, and his old neighbors were not impressed. Luke says they asked, "Isn't this Joseph's boy?" It was a way of saying, this guy comes from a family of no consequence. The circumstances of his birth were rather scandalous. Let's face it, Nazareth is just a tiny jerkwater hillbilly burg stuck on the side of a hill. He wants us to believe that the new Isaiah is here? Please. Jesus responds to their skepticism by saying that they probably want him to perform some miracle or great act of healing to prove that he's truly a prophet on a par with the legendary Isaiah. Perhaps they expect him to do something like they'd heard he'd done in Capernaum. Now, we don't know what he had done there at that point, but apparently it was something that was already causing a sensation in the region. Jesus goes on to say that even the great prophets Elijah and Elisha only healed a couple of women, and one of them was a Gentile. He essentially accuses them of having no more faith than non-Jews. He caps his criticism off by saying, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown," which I suspect was heard as, "You rubes and yokels don't get or respect me, or God." I recall pastoring in a tiny town, smaller than Nazareth, many years ago. Like so many tiny towns, the people there had a bit of an inferiority complex. At one point, I made a statement which was meant to affirm their abilities and gifts. I wrote in a newsletter that I was a pastor not because I possessed some spiritual superiority to others, but because I had received specialized training for the work. I also noted that others in the church had training and experience that was also very valuable to the work of the church, and that the church could not succeed from the efforts or abilities of any one person, especially me. I meant it as an affirmation of their importance and ability, and as an acknowledgement that I wasn't holier than them. But some folks saw it as my lording my education over them and claiming they were somehow a bunch of hicks in my eyes. Nothing could have been further from what I said or intended, but that sense of small-town inferiority created a kind of lens through which my words were distorted. The people of Nazareth saw Jesus as putting them down, while they looked on him as just a guy with a past as humble as theirs and a birth that was somewhat suspect. He was getting too big for his britches in their estimation, and they decided to put him back in his place. Luke says they took him out to a nearby cliff and were going to chunk him over the side, but that he walked through them. Now, we've been raised on images of Jesus that often make him look rather soft and almost effeminate. But this guy was a manual laborer. Carpenters were not just woodworkers, which was hard labor. They were also stonemasons, which was very hard labor. Jesus was more than likely a seriously muscular dude. Jesus may have done more than just stroll through that crowd. He could have pushed his way out. There's no record that he hurt anybody, but he didn't cooperate with the crowd. And as a lynch mob, it was probably a half-hearted one. Jesus then returns to Capernaum, where he performs a number of healings. This includes a young man who was purported to be possessed by a demon. This was the way people understood mental illness in Jesus' time, and I've dealt with people who seemed to be in the grip of a dark force or even an alternate personality. It takes a person who possesses a clear sense of authority and compassion to overcome the hold of these dark forces. Jesus spoke with an authority that came from God. He was powerful, commanding, and yet deeply compassionate. This was the power that came to him and through him from God. I can't go into detail here, but I will say that I've had moments in my ministry when I've dealt with profoundly troubled people, some bent on self-destruction, and have found myself overtaken, as it were, by a power and a presence which I was quite clear were not my own. I felt the Spirit working in and through me to help people in the grip of terrible fear, delusion, and despair. These moments have been powerful and profound, and I was quite aware that I was serving as a conduit for a wisdom and compassion far greater than anything I could summon up on my own. The people I was able to help in those moments also sensed that powerful presence that was certainly greater than me. The people of Capernaum soon spread the word through the area that there is a man who speaks and acts with divine authority. Luke says that the people whom he heals of disease and delusion proclaim him the Son of God. One of the people he heals is the mother of Simon, who will later be known as Peter. Soon the crowds won't leave him alone there in town, so he flees exhausted into the countryside, but they find him, and he decides it's time to hit the road and proclaim his message throughout the region. Thus ends Chapter 4 of Luke's Gospel and this episode of CyberBible 2.0, the online Bible study sponsored by the Union United Methodist Church of Quincy, Illinois. I'm Bob Morwell, the pastor. I invite you to post questions or comments here at YouTube. You can also find out more about our church on Facebook, or on our website at www.qumc.org. Just click on Union United Methodist Church when you get there. And of course, you're welcome to join us in the real world every Sunday. Until next time, peace.